Hello everyone. Today we're going to be looking at the first aircraft in the Steam Gauge Overhaul series from Black Square and Just Flight, the Analog Caravan. Now the Analog Caravan is a slightly different kind of add-on than we've seen for Flight Simulator before, in that it's not a completely new aircraft, but a replacement interior and systems overhaul for an existing default aircraft. I think we can all agree that the default aircraft exteriors, and in fact the flight simulator itself, are absolutely gorgeous, but they leave a lot to be desired in terms of depth of system and the complexity of some avionics, especially those cut and paste integrated flight display systems that are used in a lot of the default aircraft. That's why the Steam Gauge Overhaul series was created to breathe new life into the default Microsoft Flight Simulator aircraft, focusing on primary instrumentation, radio navigation equipment, and electrical systems. All the equipment featured in these aircraft are based on real units and designed to meet the requirements of the most serious simmers flying under instrument flight rules or those looking for a real challenge. While we're getting set up here, I encourage anyone interested in these products to take a look at the extensive manual with a systems guide covering all of the equipment included in the aircraft, operating limitations, checklists, tutorials, and even electrical schematics. It's available on justflight.com regardless of whether or not you own the aircraft, to anyone who's interested. Now once you have the aircraft installed and you're in the menu, one of the first questions you might have is whether or not you can still access the original default aircraft. And the answer is yes. You can always fly the original G1000 Caravan. They exist as two completely separate installations. Keep in mind, however, that you must have the original aircraft installed in order for the new one to work. And that's because some resources are shared between the two, such as the exterior model, the 3D sound system, and a few textures. As an added bonus, all of your favorite liveries from the default aircraft are compatible with the new analog version. They don't show up automatically, there's a short tutorial to follow in the manual, and there's also an example livery to get you started. Speaking of which, let's load up our flight. Loaded up here at Nantucket Memorial Airport in Massachusetts, the first thing I want to show you about the Analog Caravan is the hot swappable radio system. Some aircraft have a graphical user interface on a tablet for this. This one has two unobtrusive knobs here on the right side of the panel that allow you to switch between radio configurations on the fly. This is really neat because you can fly an approach with one type of system, like a large screen GPS, and then fly it again with no GPS to test your skills. As you can see, we have a no GPS option, a GNS 530 or 430, and the GTN 750. And that supports both the PMS 50 GTN and also the TDS GTN XI 750, which has become one of my favorite add-ons for Flight Simulator. I can't recommend it enough. Over here you'll see there's an additional little knob, which is to turn on and off the amphibious version of this aircraft, which gives you the gear handle right here. There might not be a float version of this aircraft right now, but there's several mods in the works, and as soon as there is one, you'll be prepared. Keep in mind that these settings and other aesthetic pieces in the aircraft, or temperature controls, or even the sun visors, their states are saved between your flights. So when you load the aircraft next time, you'll have the same radio setup as where you left it last time, and also all the frequencies that you've entered or any information in some of the navigation systems will be saved for you. While we're talking about avionics, the next thing I want to show you here is the two pieces of custom equipment built for this aircraft. We have a color weather radar here, which we can get into more later, and also a KNS-80 RNAV navigator. Now most of you, when you hear RNAV, you probably think about GPS approaches. But in fact, our modern GPS approaches are based on an old system called area navigation, which makes use of VORs only and no GPS. We'll get into the implementation of this later, but as far as I'm aware, it's the first complete RNAV system implemented in a flight simulator. So let's get things started here by pulling up one of the checklists for this aircraft. As you can see, there are a whole lot. And that's because this aircraft includes both the normal checklists and the abnormal or emergency checklists. And when you're running through those checklists, you'll discover that absolutely everything that's in the checklists is implemented in the aircraft. So if you're running through the checklists and it requires you to activate the standby flap system and use them, that will in fact work. Everything is working and should operate just like it does in the real aircraft. Let's get started with the before starting engine checklist. Pre-flight inspection is complete. Passenger cabin doors are unlocked. Cabin doors are latched. Parking brake is set. Control lock is removed. The seatbelts and seatbacks are secure. Switches are all off. Ignition switch to the normal position. Circuit breakers are all in. And you will discover that every single one of these circuit breakers is implemented, and you can use them to disable and enable systems in the aircraft and see what that does, what kind of an effect it has on the aircraft, such as if you pull the oil temperature gauge circuit breaker, you'll no longer have that indicated on the gauge. There's also some other logic-based systems, like for instance the propeller anti-ice controller. Disabling that, you'll still be able to turn on propeller de-ice, but it won't cycle, which means you can overheat the coils in the propeller and it will eventually fail. Fuel selectors are both on. That's where you can start to hear the delightful sound package from the default aircraft, which is implemented with very few limitations in the new analog version. Oxygen pressure is in the green, and as you can see, even the needles highlight with the checklist, so when you're learning the aircraft, you can have a good idea of what indications you're supposed to be looking for. And the oxygen system is simulated, by the way. Ventilation and air conditioning systems are as desired. The bleed air heat is off. Emergency power lever is in the normal position. And this does work, by the way. It disables the throttle, and you'll be able to use it as a standby throttle to control the fuel control unit in case of a primary failure. Power lever is idle. Propeller lever full forward. Fuel cutoff is in the cutoff position. The fuel cutoff switch is pushed in. These do all work, by the way, as is the firewall valve. Battery switch on. Annunciators test. They're all working. Flap lever is up. No smoking and seatbelt signs can remain off since we're the only ones aboard the aircraft. Engine starting checklist. This is the battery start as opposed to an external power start. Beacon is on. Avionics switch 1 is on. Bus volts, we need 24 volts minimum. Now you can see those really smooth gauge animations that help give the sense of a real physical system and not just a digital facsimile. And many of these gauges are actually simulated with physics, so the needles will bump around as you fly around in turbulence. Emergency power annunciator is extinguished. Propeller area is clear. Fuel boost pump to on. Fuel pressure low annunciator is off, and we can see the auxiliary fuel pump is on. Fuel flow is at 0. Starter switch, engage. Now let's watch for the oil pressure to rise. It does. Now we're looking for the NG to stabilize at its maximum value, because hot starts are possible in this aircraft as well as our hung starts. So we need to make sure that we reach maximum airflow through the engine before engaging the fuel flow, since that's the easiest way to give ourselves a hot start. Now quickly we look at the fuel flows come up. ITT stays in the green in this case. Nice cool start. We're looking for the NG to rise above the 50% mark so we can disengage the starter. Starter is off, and starter annunciator light is out, as is ignition. Engine instruments check. They are all good in the green. Generators switch to reset. As we can see here, currently the battery is supplying all the current for the aircraft, not the standby alternator or the generator. Moving the generator switch to reset will turn on the generator, and now the battery should be slightly negative charging. If we had run down the battery further before starting the engine, or perhaps if we were on external power, we would see a spike in the battery charging current, which is properly simulated in this aircraft. And if it's too high for too long, we'll see warning annunciators light up for a battery hot or battery overheat. And if we don't rectify that quickly, the battery terminals will become too hot and the battery will disconnect from the aircraft. Generator load is now positive, battery charging current was negative. Generator off annunciator is extinguished, fuel boost pump now off. Fuel boost pump annunciator is extinguished. Weather radar we put in standby to make sure that we are not transmitting when there's any ground personnel operating around the aircraft. Avionics switch 2 on. Navigation lights as required. Suction is good in the green. Remote indicating compass. This is something that's common in this type of aircraft with these sort of systems. We can use it either as a directional gyro like you might be familiar with in light aircraft, or we can put it into a mode where it will automatically seek the magnetic heading and constantly hold it there, so there's no need for readjustment in flight. And we can see that the alignment indicator shows right in the middle now, meaning that we are aligned with the magnetic heading. Ventilation and defrosters as required. All of these are simulated. Radios check. We can turn on the GPS and look for the correct indication from the HSI. We have half up and half to the left, which is correct. Next, we'll skip some of the emergency checklists here and move on, skip the taxi checklist to the run-up to show off some more features. Parking brake is set, seatbelts are secured, flight controls on my joystick here are free and correct, standby alternator on. Standby alternator should be reading 0 amps on the meter. Generator switch trip. We can see that the standby alternator is now supplying the current for the aircraft and the generator is not. We have an annunciator here that shows us that, and on the annunciator panel, standby electric power on, generator is off. We can now move the generator switch back to reset and the generator should come back online. Fuel boost pump switch to normal. Fuel selectors are both on. Fuel quantity check. And you can see that there's variation in these needles as they kind of slop around a little bit, which is very pronounced in the Caravan and will be even more pronounced in flight and is influenced by physics. Fuel cutoff is pushed in, trims are set for takeoff, flaps 10 or 20 degrees, power lever to 400 foot-pounds. Suction is good in the green. Bus volts is above 24 volts. Inertial separator on. And here we can watch for an ITT rise when we enable the separator by about 10 or 15 degrees Celsius. We do see it come up there and it should go back down when we turn it off. And it does. Engine instruments, check. They're all in the green. Power lever to idle. Now we're going to check the pitot-static heat in the aircraft. We'll go to the generator setting and turn on the pitot heat. We see the current rise indicating that the coils are working and heating the element, and the same for the stall heat warning. Windshield anti-ice, same thing. We put it in the automatic position, it rises, and in the manual position, same thing. Propeller de-ice, we do the same thing. Auto, it rises, manual rises, and then we can look at the propeller amps gauge to see what's going into the prop hub and that it's within the green range. And the airframe de-ice, only a small rise, and it is functioning. And here we want to observe the automatic cycling of the de-icing boots, which indicates that they're being cycled by the controller around the aircraft, such as the leading edge of the wings, the empennage, and the tail. Pitot heat on if less than 4 degrees Celsius. If we didn't know what the outside air temperature was right now, we can come over here to our transponder and we can cycle through function modes to see the outside air temperature and conveniently the density altitude. Ice protection as required. Autopilot master engage. This is so we can check the disengage. Unfortunately, with this implementation of the CAP 140, it will disengage automatically on the ground to prevent trim windup. Battery charging current needs to be less than 10 amps or else we can't engage full power on takeoff without possibly overheating the battery. Weather radar we can turn on when we get on the runway. Strobe lights as required. Annunciators test and consider, and hopefully we'll see the aux fuel pump turn off when the pressure gets higher when we go to high idle. Flight instruments set and check. The storm window is closed. It does open, by the way. And the fuel condition lever now to high idle. And we should hopefully see the fuel annunciator pump light go out, and it does. We are ready for takeoff. Let's go do it. While we're taxiing to the runway, let's discuss some of the failures you could see in this aircraft if you don't manage it properly. We've already touched on one of the electrical failures, the battery overheat and subsequent disconnect. You could also expect to see the starter generator fail if you run it too long during startup. All the engine parameters are also being monitored throughout your flight, which means if you run the engine too hot during cruise or allow it to exceed the startup red line during a hot start, damage will be done to your engine. You first might notice some annunciators on the panel to indicate the engine condition has been compromised. If you don't rectify the situation and land immediately, you might suffer an engine shutdown or a catastrophic failure. I thought this was also a good time to mention that if you like the taxiway signage that you see in this video, check out one of Black Square's other products, Real Taxiways for the United States and Europe. It has more accurate taxiway sign placement, content, and textures that better match what you see in the real world and can help you navigate even the most busy of international airports. Getting ready for our takeoff here, we'll take a look at the takeoff checklist. Transponder is in altitude reporting mode. Our landing lights are on, inertial separator off. Power levers will advance no further than the takeoff red line here, which is 1865 foot-pounds listed right on the panel. Annunciators will watch during takeoff. Engine instruments should be in the green. Brakes release. ITT maximum 805 for takeoff, and retract the flaps at 95 knots. I will release the brakes and advance the power levers. And no need to go up to the full maximum takeoff power today since we have a very light aircraft. We'll keep the ITT around 700 degrees Celsius to be kind to the engine and avoid any damage. We should come off the ground very quickly with such a light aircraft. We can retract the flaps. And as soon as we run out of remaining runway here, we can engage the autopilot. Climb at 1,200 feet per minute to 7,500 feet and go into heading hold mode, which is bugged to the runway heading. As soon as we're stabilized here, I can show you some of my other favorite features of this aircraft. For starters, I want to take a look at the big screen GPS here. This is the TDS GT NXI, which is not just some sort of simulation of this GPS, but it's actually the real software that runs on the GPS in the airplane just piped into Flight Simulator, which is an absolutely amazing feature. Let's say that we want to continue our flight here by flying direct to the Martha's Vineyard VOR station. We can go to the nearest page here for VORs and see Martha's Vineyard VOR 114.5 and enter that in our active frequency slot. We can see it identifies as MVY, we get DME information, and it shows up on the HSI and the nav flag goes away. As we rotate the course select knob in the HSI, we can see that we get the same bearing to the station as we do on the radio magnetic indicator, or RMI, and we can fly directly to it by selecting nav mode on the CAP 140 autopilot. A cool feature of the small DME unit in this aircraft is hold mode. When we switch to hold mode, you can see that we get the same DME information as we do on channel 1, or at least we will in a second or two. And that means that we can change the frequency here in our nav1 slot, and we keep the DME information but lose the course information on the HSI and the RMI. And that can be a useful feature in some instrument approach procedures that require having a DME frequency tune that's different than the one that you're using for lateral navigation. The next cool thing I want to show you is the KNS-80 RNAV Navigator. Just a wonderful piece of instrumentation from the days before GPS and even before LORAN or Omega, for those of you that are familiar with those systems. Let's say that we want to conduct an instrument approach procedure here at Nantucket Airport. We'll go take a look at one of the charts here, in this case for the ILS or Localizer Runway 6 approach. And you can see our aircraft currently here tracking towards Martha's Vineyard. Let's say we want to begin the approach at this initial approach fix. Now if we were going to fly this with a GPS, we would simply enter that waypoint and fly directly to it, but that's not possible using conventional navigation equipment. With the RNAV Navigator, we can see that this location here is defined as being 150 degrees and 23.6 miles away from the Martha's Vineyard VOR. Let's enter that information down here on the RNAV system. First we'll enter the frequency of 114.5, and we should see it tunes that and gives us DME information. And then we enter the radial of 150 degrees, and lastly the distance of 23.6 nautical miles. And what that does is creates a virtual waypoint at this location, just like as we would do with a GPS. And if we take a look over here and switch our HSI source to RNAV, we can see that we can rotate the course select knob until we get a direction to that waypoint, set the heading bug, activate heading hold mode on the autopilot, and we'll see the aircraft turn directly to that waypoint and fly straight to it as if it was a GPS waypoint. I know that can sound kind of confusing, but luckily there is a tutorial and a list of ways that you can use the RNAV computer in the operating manual for this aircraft. I think I'll leave it there for today and let you discover some of the more advanced features of the Analog Caravan as you use all of the circuit breakers and all of the avionics available in this aircraft to do hopefully the most complex and true-to-life flying that you've done yet in a flight simulator. Coming up next, I'll be releasing a similar technical overview video for the next aircraft in the Steam Gauge lineup, which is the Analog King Air. Until then, if you like what you saw in this video, I recommend you check out the Steam Gauge overhaul promotional video on the Just Flight YouTube channel for more scenes of these aircraft in action. If you watch until the very end of the video, you'll see a surprise announcement of the Starship for Microsoft Flight Simulator. The Starship is a personal favorite aircraft of mine, so I plan on doing justice to its unique avionics systems designed in the computer age and the first glass panel cockpit in a general aviation aircraft. Until then, I wish you all blue skies, and I will see you in the next video.